All right, I think we can move into our second part. Hopefully you had a chance to tackle some of the questions. If you are still looking for more tea, I think there's plenty available. We've had, I forget who told me that they brought the, Sandy brought the cinnamon apple one this week. Although I think that's like 20 new tea bags, so if we don't drink 20 of them, then the supply increases. That means the price goes down, right? The other two that I made are both oolongs. One of them is actually from Betty Collada and is an oolong tea that she got when she was in China. And the other one is from a place here in Fargo. So as this was a bit of a tougher chapter, like I said, did you guys have questions you got stumped by or things you wanted to know yourself? I see some head scratching and eye rolling. No one had questions? Oh, we have our first question. You win the lottery.
The man at the pool.
Yep.
That was waiting to be healed for 38 years.
Mm-hmm.
The question was he just there during a certain festival, or was it every day? Or?
Oh, the man at the pool who was waiting to be healed. Well, this is a good question that I would say, what do you think? What is his ailment? No, Jesus did this all the time. Come on, I'm just imitating him. So what was his ailment? He was paralyzed, or at least he couldn't walk. He couldn't move very well to get himself to the pool when it was stirred up, right? So someone like that probably didn't move around a lot. I mean, maybe someone would bring him to the pool at certain times, but my suspicion is that he probably kind of laid there like the homeless would now, that he probably couldn't move very much or at all. And I think he's a good character because this is another place where it's good to think about it. We sort of have to turn a character back into someone round. I picked up a biography of a saint to read yesterday, and I ended up putting it down. The book is worthless. Someone wrote a worthless book because the picture, it's about St. Peter Claver, who worked in, I think, the northern part of South America where the slave ships would arrive from Africa. And he would go out to meet the slave ships and take the Africans food and teach them and baptize them. And his superiors got mad at him and the city hated him, but he did it anyway. And I have a friend who's religious, and his name is Father James Claver. His name in religion is Father James Claver. So I thought I would read this biography, but the biography is worthless because it took him, and it's like, oh, he never had an errant thought in his entire life. His whole life was totally and completely set on God from the womb, and he knew immediately he was supposed to be a priest, and he became a novice, and he was the perfect novice and never had any problems and never had any faults and never had any failures. And it made me angry and want to write a short story about this saint that's actually a statue, this floating statue that follows people around. And then at the end of the short story, someone would say, but Father, it's a statue, it's not a person. Because that's what easily happens to us in the scriptures too, is we sort of read about things and they become flat. Like they're two-dimensional or maybe even one-dimensional. Like, oh, okay, there's this guy laying there for 38 years and he needs healing. But we can make them round again. Think about this. If you had to lay somewhere for 38 years, let's say that he was there the entire time, and not necessarily brought there for specific festivals and things, how would you feel about life? What would be, if you had to start pondering this, what would probably go through your mind if it was you? You'd be mad and upset. Why would you be upset?
Where's the compassion in the other people that were there that nobody helped them?
The compassion in other people. For years, people would come and go into the pool and he'd see them walk right by him and ignore him. Yes, I think that's a part of it. What else?
I probably got some questions for God.
You'd probably have some questions for God, like what?
Like, why me? And
Why me? Do you hear me? I'm laying here. This is, a broken world. So there's probably some anger in his heart, probably some frustration, and in some cases probably some righteous anger that people have passed him by for years and not helped him, not taking care of him.
He was probably in the same community where the friends of this other guy broke through a roof.
Well, that is up north in Galilee.
Further north?
This is in Jerusalem.
Okay.
This is one of the baths in Jerusalem. I think actually, if you go to Jerusalem now, you usually go to the spot where these baths were, because the oldest church in the city, I think, is next to them. There's a Crusader church, I think, called St. Anne's from the 1100s, and it's the oldest still standing church in Jerusalem, which is really weird. There's parts of like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that are older, but even that building is newer than this one. And I think that's where it is. It's over kind of on the east end of the old city. I think it's north of the temple area, if I remember right. You go and there's this St. Anne's church, and it's very plain. I mean, Crusader churches were not a lot to look at. And then there's these ruins, and they tell you, oh, these ruins are these baths. They're nice looking ruins. I mean, one of the tough parts if you go to Israel, or even if you go to Rome, you have to be a little bit ready for this. Ruins look like ruins look like ruins, and after a while they all basically look the same. I mean, you see some rocks on the ground, and sometimes they're arranged around in like rooms, but you're like, meh. And you look at the other one, and that looks the same as the last set that we saw. Part of me, maybe it's being younger and more millennial without a sense of history, but part of me wishes they would have rebuilt some of these things so that you could actually see it. Because it's, you see the floor plan of a house and you can kind of get an idea of what the house looks like, but it's often better to see the house. So when we do this kind of exercise with this man, it's not to say that all of this is necessarily true or in the scriptures, but I think we have to work at turning characters into round people again. Like trying to get away from this one-dimensionality, like, oh, they met Jesus, everything was perfect, they had no issues before, they were just laying there peacefully waiting for him. Like, no, that's not the way it worked.
Well, the only thing that he had was hope, we talked about, but what if somebody did help him in there? He's paralyzed, he's drowned.
So that's the other piece, is that even though he probably wants people to put him in the water, being paralyzed, it's not really a safe place for him to be. Although, at the same time, the Jews weren't unintelligent when they built these things, the Jewish people, so there were often like these stone stairs on one end that went down into the water, because, these were areas where people would go to bathe. I don't know if they would gather water, or they had different ones where they collected water for their homes from. But those are good points. What?
Well, I just said I hope so, because if they're bathing in them, I hope they had different places.
Well, but I mean, one of the things that you have to know, remember, this is a world where they don't know that bacteria exist. That's a discovery that doesn't come for thousands of years. They don't know that viruses exist. So they would see problems. But I mean, like in a lot of cases in infectious diseases, one of their primary forms of treatment was like you have too much blood, so they'd cut you open and let some blood drain out. And you know, now modern medicine would say, yeah, not so much. You know, so you do have to know. I mean, they did figure out the correlation of some things, but there's all kinds of things that they didn't know. For instance, Rome, the Romans, in most of their aqueducts that carried water from places, lined them with lead. Huge numbers of people in the Roman Empire had lead poisoning and had bad brain development. I was listening to a series of lectures about daily life in the ancient world one time, and they looked at this cemetery in Greece, and over 30% of the people buried in it had intestinal parasites. Like, there were all kinds of diseases that were way more common. Their teeth were often bad because when they milled grain, they would have this big stone that rolled around on another stone. And what happens is you actually get rock dust mixed in with your flour, and it wrecks your teeth. So again, you have to we have to work to put the ancient world back together and put these pieces in our mind, because for us, the idea of drinking bathing water would be, you know, just out there and we wouldn't do it. But for them, if you don't know about bacteria, if you don't have any idea about microorganisms, if you don't have any idea about mold and viruses and those kind of things, there's a lot of stuff that isn't quite as obvious as it is to us. I mean, now we live in a world that's so much shaped by these things, and they didn't know. I mean, we've talked before, and I think I've told you, there's 2 inventions that I would want if I was stranded on a desert island. Everything else I feel like I could live without, but there's 2 of them that I would really want. Anyone guess what they are? Refrigeration. Someone's heard me say this before. Refrigeration and what? Nope. Nope. Indoor plumbing. But if you think about it, I mean, think about what would happen in North Dakota, for instance, without refrigeration. How do you cook? What did people do in the old days? They would have things outside in the winter, but they did something else.
They use salt a lot.
They salted things and they canned them. Because canned things don't need refrigeration.
They had underground.
Right, they would have root cellars, and you could keep some things down there. They'd keep longer, but for the most part, they canned stuff. They canned like crazy because you could preserve it without refrigeration. Okay, we better get to our story or we're going to get in trouble. So Jesus comes to this bath. I forget if it says what it is. Which one? Oh yes, Bethesda. Or Bethzatha. Good old names of Hebrew things. Now, here, one of the pieces is washing in the water would be an image of baptism. To be healed by washing in water, so that's one of the sacramental connections. There's 5 porticos. And so in this story, what happens is there's these layers, right? We talked about the layers before. So the first initial layer, the literal meaning of the story is what? Nope. Jesus heals a man who's laying there from paralysis, a physical illness. Right? That's the initial layer of the story. That Jesus came and he healed someone, first layer. The second layer would be the spiritual sense of things. What paralyzes us? Sin. What does Jesus come to do? To free us from sin. He talks about rising, taking up your mat, and walking. That's an image of resurrection. So the second layer is of the spiritual danger of sin, Jesus healing people from sin, the paralysis from sin. The third layer is something that you might pick up on if you're paying very close attention, but otherwise it's easy to miss. It involves the 5 porticos. In the last chapter, we had a woman with 5 husbands, and the 5 husbands were an image of the 5 peoples that were settled and the 5 books of Moses. So here you have a third layer that is also working on the dimension of the Old Covenant, which is founded upon the sacrificial system and the temple and the rules of Judaism. And what it has left is man paralyzed and unable to help himself and unable to free himself. What is the solution to the paralysis? Encountering Jesus himself and standing in a new relationship with God. That Jesus himself actually communicates the grace of God. Do you see the third layer here? That there's also a commentary about the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. The transition from the imposition of the law. St. Paul talks about this, I think, in the book of Romans, and how the law doesn't free anyone from sin because the blood of bulls and goats can't do it, like it says in the book of Hebrews. But in Jesus Christ, you have the blood of an unblemished lamb who does not offer sacrifice on your behalf, but offers himself, who communicates the grace that he signifies. So you see how you can start teasing out these layers, and in the details of the story, it fits. Like John specifically mentions the 5 porticos, and it's the same thing that happened in chapter 4. Jesus comes to find him. My suspicion is that he came specifically for this man. That he heard the man calling to him. Something about this man must have been a man of faith. He must have been a man that even though he probably experienced frustration and sadness and difficulty, he also must have had a relationship with God. Because there's a line from the book of Matthew, but it applies here. Those who seek will find. Here you have a man who must have been seeking God, because what happens? He finds him. Jesus shows up. This isn't the only time in the gospel that this kind of thing happens.
There were people actually healed in that pool, all right?
Most likely. I mean, the tradition must have come from somewhere. He asked, were there actually people healed in the pool? The tradition must have come from somewhere. So my suspicion is yes. I mean, we do have to remember that God acted in Israel. Israel was a land where people were cured from things, where prophets did pray for people. And there's more prophets in the land than appear in the scriptures. You know that because sometimes they show up for like one line and you've like never heard of them, and then they disappear again. It's like they must have said something, you know. Or we went to seek the prophet, like the prophet Nathan. He's not mentioned until David goes to find him. Well, if he was there, he must have been a prophet before David went to find him, because David knew about him.
So the question we kind of out of the blue. So if he was a man of faith who was seeking God, and Jesus came and told him, take your mat and stand up, why when the Jewish authorities asked him, did he recognize who had healed him?
Well, that I think is a good question. Why did he not recognize who had healed him?
Yeah. I mean, would he just feel like it was God?
Well, would he feel like it was God? You have to know about Jesus that something about him is special. Well, there's lots of things that are special, but in this way, like, he is found when he wants to be found. And when he doesn't want to be found, he's like a ninja. He's sneaky. And he sort of fades into the crowd and disappears and looks like everyone else. And there's times, for instance, after the resurrection, I think Jesus has the biggest smile on his face, and I think he's just having a party. Because he is like, they're talking about him, and he appears like right in the middle of their conversation. He's like, boo! And then they start talking to him, and in the middle of a sentence, he disappears. And then he appears again. And there's just all of these funny instances, like in the Gospel of John, hopefully we'll get there before the end of the year, where he's on the shore and he's making, he just shows up and he's making fish, and it's, where did he get the fish from? And then he looks out and he sees the apostles and he's like, oh, have you caught anything? Knowing full well the answer to the question already. Like, you could almost imagine him just walking out on the water like, oh, shoot, tough day of fishing, isn't it? What if he appeared underwater as a giant fish and shot into the air and is like, boo, and then disappeared, right? So there's something about him, though, that like, when he doesn't want you to find him, you don't. And there's a connection here. The man will recognize Jesus when he goes where? To the temple. And think about that, because there you see the layers pop out again. The initial layer, the root meaning of the story, is the man went to the temple after he was healed. But there's a much more important, deeper layer to it. That when he's healed, he goes to the temple, the dwelling place of God, because he's restored to worship. And when he's worshiping God in the temple, he encounters Jesus and recognizes him. So again, you can feel the layers in this story and how if you pay attention, you can pull them out. This story asks the question, what is the source and meaning of illness? Is illness a curse? Is it from sin? Is it from parents? Is it an act of divine justice? Is it God's angry with you? God's upset with the nation? X, Y, and Z? And the answer is we don't always know. I was visiting with a friend of mine in Phoenix, and one of the things that he said to me almost right away, which was really fascinating and I think gives a good perspective to things, is I was telling him about my whole adventure with health things, and he said, well, Jesus is inviting you to participate in the redemption of the world. And he said there's a lot of people that are being invited into this because things are such a mess at the moment. And, we kind of continued on in the conversation, but it's like, yeah, that makes sense. That there's this invitation, no matter where illness comes from, to suffer with the Lord. That no matter where things happen from, could some of them be from sin? The answer is yes. Could some of it be from actions of your parents? The answer is yes. We know genetics and biology now, for instance, even stuff like, what is it, the vitamin that they start women on as soon as they find out they're pregnant, folic acid or something, because it's very important for avoiding some birth defects. But, if a woman didn't know she was pregnant and didn't have signs of it, is it her fault that she wouldn't do that or that something would happen? No. But it's the cause of problems. There's all kinds of things that are in this kind of category. So yes, some of them could be from sin, some of them could be from parents. Some illnesses are there to reveal the glory of God. We're going to encounter one of those in a little bit when Jesus provokes a crisis of faith on the part of the Pharisees. So the man is there for 38 years. Now 38, this is where you have to get suspicious of details, because every detail in the story is important. So there were 5 porticos and it was mentioned. There may have been a dozen more, who knows? But he also mentions 38 years. 38 years is the time that Israel wandered in the desert. So the wandering in the desert was for 38 years where they were lost and without a relationship with God because they rejected what he said. And after 38 years, they enter the promised land with Joshua. And it's probably, so in the scriptures, the image that they use is not 38, but a generation is 40 years. But they're kind of close enough. And I think what happened is there's people that use round numbers. They use round numbers in a lot of places. 40 is important because 40 is the number of the days of the flood and Noah. And 40 is the days... was Jesus in the desert for 40 days in the time of temptation? And I think 40 shows up again in the book of Revelation somewhere. But 38 years is probably the same kind of thing. Maybe sometimes there's rabbinical stuff behind it, and they probably actually figured out it was 38 years or something. But anyway, it's a sign of Israel wandering in the desert. They're brought to the promised land, and that has another thing to teach us, because in Christianity, in the New Covenant, where is the promised land? I'll give you a hint. It's not a chunk of physical ground. Nope, not heaven. The promised land is Jesus himself. The promised land, I mean, to a certain extent, it is kind of heaven. That's the ultimate land of the promise. But like Jesus will say, I confer on you a kingdom. Where is the kingdom? The kingdom is in the hearts of those who believe. The kingdom is in Jesus Christ himself. The kingdom is in the relationship that he has with God and that we're invited into. Okay, so by what authority do you do this? This is a question. You did this, so now who gave you authority to do it? Now, what's the answer to that question? Who gave Jesus authority to do it? His Father, God himself. That's how Jesus is going to answer it. So the Jewish leadership confronts this man who's carrying his pallet. Why is he carrying his pallet, his mat that he was sitting on? Because Jesus told him to. Now this is weird, because his Jewish brain should have said, wait a minute, I'm not supposed to do this on the Sabbath. This is one of the rules. But he listened to Jesus and he didn't think about it. He was probably rather excited that he was healed. So he just picked up his mat and he's walking along, and the Pharisees or the Jewish leadership confront him. And what do they ask him? Why are you carrying your pallet? Who said you could do this? Now, he says, I don't know. And the story doesn't really tell us, but what do you think they're really concerned about? It's not the man carrying his pallet. They just sort of leave him alone. They're upset that he's carrying his pallet because you're not supposed to do that on the Sabbath, but you get the impression that they don't really care, because what are they out to do? They're out to nail Jesus. And so nothing will stand in their way. Everything else has to make way because they're ready to get Jesus. Now this is really, really fascinating, because there's this line which we have in Advent, and I think is good to pay attention to. The Pharisees and the Jewish leadership missed the time of their visitation. Right? They're supposed to spend their entire lives preparing the way for the Messiah to come. In this case, what is actually happening? The Messiah is in Jerusalem, and they're trying to kill him. But this is something that I think we have to pay attention to and really hear, because there's also a critique in the middle of this that is for religious people and is something that should hit us as well, is that it's easy to get caught in things, it's easy to get caught in rules, it's easy to get caught in a God who works the way that we think he should, and you miss the God who comes to visit you. You miss the God in your daily life. You walk right past him because you're set on doing X, Y, and Z things, right? So that's something that I think we have to hear, because in some ways in the story we end up being like the Pharisees or the Jewish leadership. And I think if we can hear that happen, if we can feel it inside of us, that there are times where we miss the Lord coming to us, then we're much more likely to keep our eyes open and look for Him. You know, if you're scared that He's going to sneak by you, if you're concerned about finding Him and His kingdom because He has this habit of showing up where He's not always expected, then you look for Him. You know, if He's like a 300-pound moose, you don't have to look very far. It's like the moose is over there. But in some ways, like I said before, I think with Jesus you have to think of Him a little bit like a divine ninja. He's sneaky, and He likes to hide. And here they judge Jesus. They're upset about what He did, but they judge Him wrongly. So he encounters the man in the temple. He says, "Sin no more." And here the word that is used is like a stain on a cloth. That sin is a stain. Sin damages, you could say, our relationship with God. But it also relates to another piece that we're going to return to again and again, that when you offer the sacrifice at Passover, it has to be an unblemished lamb. It's the same word. A lamb without stain on it. A sinless lamb, you could say. And that language of worship and that language of Passover, that is often in the background of the Gospel of John. You are made well. What made Him well? You could say that what made Him well is the true worship of God. You are made whole again. You are restored. And being restored is not just restored to your daily life or to do what you were doing before, but you're restored to a relationship with God. And we talked about how that He comes to the temple to worship God, probably to give thanks. He's probably excited. He's probably going crazy telling people about it. But this is also where He encounters Jesus, in the house of His Father. We talked about the layers, that man under the law, under the Old Testament, is held bound because it doesn't provide a way for freedom, doesn't provide a way for forgiveness. That comes in Christ. And then He says, "My Father is working and I am working." This is all about the Sabbath day. Now, why is this important? What is it about the Sabbath that God did? All the way back at the beginning of creation. The Sabbath is the seventh day where the Scriptures kind of plainly say God rested. And did you catch how the Jewish authorities have to decide, well, what does God's rest mean? What does God do on the Sabbath? And they decide that He does two things. What? To judge people and to provide life. Those were the two things that the Jewish rabbis had decided on. Some of this probably is recorded in a giant work called the Talmud. Does anyone know what the Talmud is? Have you heard of the Talmud before? So the Talmud is a commentary on what is called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is a commentary on the Scriptures. But it's this giant collection, I think it's often in like 30 volumes, give or take, of thousands of pages of rabbinical teaching. Much of it from the time of Jesus, some of it comes later. There's all kinds of things that are being found in it that help us understand the Scriptures. One day I kind of hope to read pieces of it, but it's like 30,000 pages. You know, just some light reading.
Like a Congress law.
But here, Jesus says something that sets them off. What does He say that really gets their goat? It's the burr in their saddle. How does he do that?
What did she say?
Calls himself God. He says, my Father is working and so am I.
He also told him Moses was going to judge him.
We're going to get to Moses and judgment in a second. So we talked about that. The Sabbath is something important here. And I think, again, this is a critique that we have to hear. Because it's easy to say, to go after the Jewish people who are upset about this man carrying his pallet on the Sabbath, right? What are they actually trying to do?
Discredit.
Well, let's leave Jesus out of the question for a second. What are the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership actually trying to do when it comes to the Sabbath? Make people obey the Sabbath. Why? What is it? You have to be careful with this because we do this all the time. And there's a challenge here that we need to hear. The Pharisees and the Jewish leadership are trying to help people follow the 10 Commandments. The commandment is to keep holy the Sabbath, and they consider it a matter of life and death, a matter of faithfulness to God. You could say they consider it a matter of mortal sin. Is that a bad thing? No. And you see how you have to be careful, because it's easy to be like, oh, those Pharisees, they want power and they want control and they want authority and they want to tell people what to do. And that's all the stereotype. At the heart, the movement of the Pharisees, Jesus doesn't disagree with. Keeping holy the Sabbath is of fundamental importance. And it's something that we have to hear because we've grown very lax in our own day. They may have been too crazy about keeping holy the Sabbath and how you can't even carry a mat. On the other hand, we barely think about it at all. You know, would this commandment be a matter of life and death for you? And the answer for most of us is no. We've lost something that needs to be found. And you have to remember that there are times and there are places where definitely pride and vanity and control and desire and authority get involved. That's definitely on the part of the Jewish authorities. But at its heart is an instinct that is good. And Jesus will often affirm the instinct and say you're applying it wrong. And that's something, like I said, I think we have to hear because we're very cavalier about the Sabbath. We're not very good at taking it. And that's something that we need to hear because God could very easily, Jesus could very easily reproach us and say, you know, you pick on the Jewish people who are really trying to keep holy the Sabbath and you don't even try. And so remember that because there's something important there. And like I said, I think it's good for us to hear these messages in their intensity and to let them kind of hit us in the face because then Christianity is real. Then Christianity is something like if it's a religion that's fluffy, if it's a religion that's like clouds that float by on a sunny day, then it's not worth very much. Christianity is a faith that generations of believers have said is worth dying for. That even to offer a single grain of incense to an idol is something worth giving your life for. The Jewish people would have argued that following these commandments, living in this way, is something worth giving your life for because this is what God has asked us to do. Now, their applications of it go too far, certainly, but there's an instinct here that I think we need to recover. So he talks about the work of the Father and the Son. Now this is interesting because the Jewish people had two things that God did on the Sabbath. I would argue that here actually Jesus gives us more things that he does. Because the first thing that Jesus responds with is the Father loves the Son, and the Son loves the Father. So I would say a fuller picture of what God does on the Sabbath, the first piece is that He loves. He loves us into existence. He loves us into being. That love is an action, that it's an active state. God certainly gives life, but gives life in more than one sense. This is something that we have to be careful of. One of my favorite lines in the entire Scripture is in this part. Let's see, what does it say? Amen, amen, I say to you, the hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. That to hear the voice of the Son is to live. And this is strange, right? Because Jesus says the hour is now here when those who are dead will hear the voice of the Son and live. But He's talking to people that are arguably alive and not dead. So what does He mean? Spiritual death, probably, and spiritual death comes from sin. And what do people who are dead in sin need? Resurrection. Restoration to life. Is that something we can do ourselves? Nope. Something that He has to give us.
Father, just a question. The Jewish people, do they worship or keep the Sabbath? What day of the week did they, not that that's important, but...
Oh, it is. It is very important. What day of the week did the Jews keep as a Sabbath? Saturday, the seventh day. Why did Christians move the Sabbath to Sunday? Because the day that Jesus rose from the dead changed everything. History changed on that day. Time was never the same again. That had never happened before. It's planting a flag on the day of the resurrection and saying, this matters so much more than anything else that has ever happened, that our entire lives, our entire calendar should be centered around this day, when life overcame death, when for the first time someone rose, and rose in the fullness of that. But this is such a line to ponder, that God gives life, that those who hear the voice of the Son of God will live. That to encounter Jesus, to study His Word, to hear His voice, is to have life. And if you don't hear His voice, if you don't study Him, if you live a life of dissipation, you're living a life of death. Do we not see this in the modern world, where there's all this busyness, and at the heart people are lonely and afraid and anxious? That you can do all of these things. We live in the richest society that has ever existed on earth. We have more food and more power and more authority than people have ever had. And we're more miserable than ever as a society. There's fascinating pieces that are underlying this.
There's lots of alienation in our society between fathers and sons and mothers and daughters and all this stuff. How close should our life be patterned to the life between Christ and the Father?
So his question was about the tensions in family relationships between fathers and sons and mothers and daughters and everyone in between, and how much should our life be patterned on the relationship of Jesus and Jesus with His Father. And I would say all of it. The ideal, and that's actually what he mentions, that's what he's inviting us into, that's what this passage describes, is the relationship of the Son to the Father. That it's a perfect communion of love that's eternal. That they're giving themselves to each other. That you are related to God as sons and daughters of the Father because of what Jesus did. And that's something that I think we have to strive to work toward. What's meant to be the strongest image of it here on earth is the relationship of husband and wife. The love that is made from self-gift and overflows. That's meant to be the strongest image, to image in our flesh and in our bodies and in the way that they live, in a broader sense, what the love of God looks like. The love of friendship is meant to be like this as well. We mentioned that a little bit last week, that it should be normal for friends to encourage you in virtue. It should be normal for friends to encourage you in your Christian life. It should be normal for friends to study the scriptures together, to pray out loud together, or to do some of these things. That's something that we have to recover, that the bond of friendship is one that is actually at the heart of marriage as well. That marriage is a kind of friendship, a particular kind of friendship, and a special kind of friendship, an exclusive kind of friendship, but it's also a friendship when it's lived well. But that the love of friends can be a tremendous support. When you have someone that's kind of like a soulmate, when you find one, it's something pretty special. And our hearts come alive. So there's a lot of those pieces that I think are good reflections. And this is part of what we can tease out of the scriptures, what we can grow in, I think, as we read these passages. Because, again, what I would encourage you to pay attention to, and we see it so much in this gospel in particular, are how these layers start happening. And we've returned to them again and again, how there's often a surface story, and we never want to let go of that literal sense and the surface story that's there, because that's what everything else is based on. You know, like the story of the healing of this man in the bath, or the pool of Bethsaida, or whatever it's called. The names get all confusing after a while, right? But there's an initial layer to the story, and then there's often another layer, a spiritual layer, and sometimes there's also this layer of a larger commentary on this transition, especially in the Gospel of John. We felt it from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And we've talked about how important this question that's in the background of what does it mean to be Jewish is for this gospel. That again and again, you find Jesus talking about the reality of faith and the life of the human person. And I think offering a different interpretation of Judaism than the Jewish authorities do. They're similar in intention and similar in desire, but they look and feel very different because of what Jesus describes being at the heart of it. What Jesus describes being as the center of things. So I guess we've reached the end of our time for today. We did not get very far. It's your fault. It's not my fault for talking too much. It's not that we got... So I guess next week we will have to finish chapter 5 and maybe start chapter 6. I did really intend to get to it and failed because